A bright midday sun cast a warm glow over the small convenience store, tucked into the corner of a busy street. The hum of soft background music and quiet footsteps filled the air as people shuffled through the aisles, scanning shelves for their favorite snacks and small necessities. Jaden, a young black teen dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, slipped in through the door. He looked around, taking in the layout of the store. His gaze landed on a display of electronics near the back wall, and with a small smile of excitement, he walked over to check out the latest headphones on display. Jaden examined the headphones carefully, flipping the price tag and mentally calculating how much money he had saved up. They were just a little out of his budget, but he couldn't resist admiring them for a few moments, imagining how good it would feel to finally own them. A brief look of determination crossed his face as he planned how he could earn a little more and come back to buy them. Across the store, the cashier glanced at Jaden, then looked away as if dismissing him. But the subtle unease didn't go unnoticed by a middle-aged police officer, Officer Scott, who had just entered the store. Dressed in his uniform, with his arms crossed in a rigid stance, Officer Scott scanned the aisles with a sense of duty, and perhaps suspicion. His gaze landed on Jaden, lingering just a moment too long, as if he saw something he didn't trust. Jaden didn't notice the officer at first. He was too busy considering the headphones, his fingers running over the smooth plastic packaging. But after a moment, he glanced up, feeling a strange sense of being watched. His eyes met Officer Scott's hard, unblinking stare. Jaden quickly looked away, feeling a twinge of nervousness. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but there was something in the way the officer looked at him that made him feel guilty for just existing in that space. Officer Scott's stare grew heavier, his gaze narrowing slightly as he took a step closer, though he made no move to speak yet. Jaden felt his throat tighten as he sensed Officer Scott moving closer. He tried to focus on the headphones, pretending not to notice, but his hand hovered in midair, unsure whether to put the headphones down or keep holding them. The small store, which had felt warm and inviting just moments ago, suddenly seemed much smaller, the aisles narrower as the tension in the air thickened. From the corner of his eye, Jaden noticed an older woman in the next aisle. She looked over briefly, clutching her purse tighter, and glancing quickly at Officer Scott before returning to her shopping. Her face showed a flicker of concern, not necessarily for Jaden, but as if she were silently grateful that someone was there to keep an eye on him. Jaden's heart sank, and his grip tightened around the headphones, his mind racing. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just looking, but no one else seemed to believe that. As if on cue, Officer Scott finally broke the silence, his footsteps purposeful as he closed the distance between them. Jaden barely had a chance to look up before the officer's shadow loomed over him, and he heard the unmistakable tone of authority in his voice. "Is there a problem here?" Officer Scott asked, his gaze fixed intently on Jaden. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a cold suspicion. Jaden hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. His mouth opened, but he struggled for words, his mind frantically searching for an explanation, even though he knew he didn't need one. No, sir. I'm just looking," Jaden managed to say, his voice softer than he intended. He kept his tone respectful, not wanting to give Officer Scott any reason to accuse him of something he hadn't done. But Officer Scott's expression remained stern. He looked down at the headphones in Jaden's hand, then slowly back up at Jaden, his gaze lingering as though waiting for a confession. The silence between them felt heavy, and Jaden's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He looked back at the headphones, the desire to buy them now overshadowed by a rising sense of unease. Still, he didn't want to give up his ground entirely. Trying to keep his voice steady, he repeated, "I was just looking, sir. That's all." Officer Scott's lips pressed into a thin line as he gave a slight, disbelieving nod. His eyes traveled over Jaden from head to toe, taking in the simple clothes, the worn sneakers, the backpack slung over his shoulder. To anyone else, Jaden would have looked like any other teenager, but to Officer Scott, there was something he didn't trust. With a sigh that sounded more annoyed than concerned, Officer Scott reached out, his hand resting on the edge of the headphones. Just looking," he muttered, his tone filled with doubt. Funny, I've seen a lot of kids just looking over the years, and it doesn't usually end well. Jayden felt his face flush with anger, but he kept his head down, not wanting to make the situation worse. He could sense a couple of customers watching from nearby, whispering amongst themselves, but no one spoke up for him. No one seemed willing to question the officer's actions, as though they all assumed the worst because Scott did. "I don't want any trouble," Jayden said, his voice barely above a whisper, but firm enough to convey his sincerity. He started to place the headphones back on the display, feeling the sting of humiliation that came with letting go of something he'd wanted so much. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his expression neutral. Officer Scott didn't step back, though. Instead, he stayed close, his presence overpowering and unyielding, as if he was waiting for Jayden to slip up, to make a wrong move, to confirm the suspicions he'd already formed in his mind. Jayden could feel the weight of Scott's judgment hanging over him, pressing down as though it had the power to define him. "Good idea," Officer Scott said flatly. He pointed toward the door, his gaze unrelenting. "Why don't you just move along? You're not buying anything, and we don't need anyone hanging around making people uncomfortable." Jayden's hand trembled slightly as he let go of the headphones, a quiet sigh escaping his lips. He forced himself to nod, though a pang of frustration flared up inside him. He had saved up just to afford something he wanted, something that felt like a small reward for his hard work. But here he was, forced out before he'd even had a chance to make a choice, all because he didn't look like he belonged. Jayden's gaze drifted to the door, then back to Officer Scott, who continued to watch him like he was a threat. "All right," Jayden said, barely able to keep the bitterness from his voice. "I'll go." He turned slowly, trying to preserve some semblance of dignity, but he couldn't ignore the hot sting of embarrassment that crept over him. As he walked toward the exit, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the glass door. For a moment he barely recognized himself, just another kid people looked at with suspicion, not because of his actions, but because of the way he looked. Outside, the air felt heavy, and Jayden took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He thought about his mom, who was supposed to meet him soon to pick up groceries together. She'd raised him to stay calm in situations like these, to keep his head down and not cause a scene. But even with her advice echoing in his mind, it didn't make the moment any easier to swallow. He pulled out his phone, checking the time and wondering how much longer he'd have to wait. Meanwhile, inside the store, Officer Scott watched Jayden through the glass, his expression hard and unreadable. He turned back to the store clerk, who had been observing the whole interaction from behind the counter. The clerk seemed uneasy, but Scott shrugged, dismissing it. "Just keeping an eye on things," Scott muttered, almost as if trying to justify himself. "You never know these days." The clerk gave a reluctant nod but said nothing, glancing toward the door where Jayden had disappeared. Jayden stood outside, hands in his pockets, his fingers clenched around his phone. He could still feel the weight of the officer's stare, even through the glass, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth. The street was busy, cars whizzing by, people walking in and out of stores, all wrapped up in their own lives. But for Jayden, it felt like everyone's eyes were on him, like the judgment that started inside the store had followed him out. He shifted his gaze down the block, hoping to catch a glimpse of his mom's car. She'd texted earlier to say she was almost there. Jayden thought of how she would react if she knew what had just happened. He imagined her face, her worry mixed with disappointment, not in him, but in the world that seemed determined to make things harder for him. He shook his head, deciding it was better not to tell her. She had enough to worry about. A few minutes passed, each one dragging slower than the last, and then he heard it, a sudden sharp screech of tires, followed by a loud, crunching crash. Jayden's head snapped up, his heart lurching as he spotted the source of the noise. Just down the street, 2 cars had collided, and a small crowd was beginning to gather. Jayden's eyes widened as he recognized the car in the crash. His heart raced, and without a second thought, he bolted toward the scene, weaving through the scattering crowd. When he reached the crumpled vehicle, his fears were confirmed. It was his mother's car. the front end smashed against another. "Mom!" he shouted, his voice breaking with worry. He rushed to the driver's side window, his hands pressing against the glass as he peered in, desperate to see if she was okay. Inside, his mom looked shaken, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her breathing shallow but steady. She turned to him, relief flooding her face as she recognized her son, though her expression remained dazed. Jaden's heart pounded as he quickly opened the car door, reaching out to steady his mother as she slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes were wide, still in shock from the impact. He guided her gently, helping her out of the driver's seat, speaking in a low, soothing voice to keep her calm. "It's okay, Mom," he murmured, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "I'm here. Just breathe, all right? You're safe." She nodded, taking a deep, shaky breath, clutching his arm for support as she regained her footing. Around them, the small crowd had grown, murmurs of concern and curiosity buzzing through the bystanders. Jaden's focus remained entirely on his mother, his hand firm but gentle as he guided her to a nearby bench, easing her down to sit. He knelt in front of her, his eyes searching her face for any signs of injury, worry etching lines on his young face. "Are you hurt anywhere?" he asked softly, his voice steady despite the panic coursing through him. She shook her head, offering a weak but reassuring smile. "I'm okay," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Just a little shaken up. That car came out of nowhere." Jaden felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. He sensed movement nearby, and as he glanced up, he saw Officer Scott standing just a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. Scott's expression had shifted, his previous air of authority now replaced with a hint of awkwardness, as he realized who the accident involved. The officer hesitated, his eyes darting between Jaden and his mother, as if piecing together the connection. Jaden locked eyes with him, his gaze steady and unyielding, a silent message passing between them. The same young man he'd dismissed and humiliated only moments before was now in front of him, not as a suspicious kid, but as a devoted son, caring for his mother in a moment of crisis. Officer Scott's stance faltered as he took in the scene, the stern expression on his face softening into something almost like regret. He cleared his throat, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. It was as if he wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. The realization that he had misjudged Jaden hit him visibly, the weight of it settling into the lines on his face. Jaden, however, had no intention of making this moment easier for the officer. His attention returned to his mother, whose breathing had steadied. She looked at her son, a faint smile crossing her lips as she reached up to touch his face, grateful to have him by her side. Jaden smiled back, the warmth between them cutting through the lingering tension around them. He gently took her hand in his gaze softening as he reassured her once again. "It's going to be all right, Mom," he said, his voice gentle. "I'll take care of everything." Officer Scott, feeling more out of place than ever, took a step forward, clearing his throat again as if to regain some semblance of authority. He opened his mouth, hesitating before finally speaking, his tone unusually quiet. Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice lacking the sharpness it held earlier. He glanced down at Jaden, an uncomfortable, almost apologetic look crossing his face. Jaden looked up at him, his expression unreadable. There was a calm strength in his gaze that Officer Scott hadn't noticed before, a maturity that made him pause. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, neither saying a word. Jaden didn't need to speak. The silence was enough. It spoke volumes, a silent confrontation that left Scott visibly uneasy. After a tense moment, Jaden finally replied, his voice firm but controlled. "We're fine," he said, his tone carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to catch Scott off guard. The uncomfortable silence lingered between them, thick and unbroken. Officer Scott shifted, looking as though he might say something more, but Jaden's unwavering gaze held him in place. The officer's eyes flickered with something that resembled guilt, and he glanced down, unable to meet Jaden's steady stare any longer. Jaden turned his attention back to his mother, gently squeezing her hand. The crowd had mostly dispersed, Satisfied that no one was seriously injured, a few people remained, whispering to each other, stealing glances at Officer Scott and the young man he had so quickly dismissed just minutes before. The irony was clear to everyone watching, though no one said a word. After a beat, Officer Scott tried again, his voice barely above a murmur, as if he was struggling with each word. I apologize if I misread things earlier," he said, awkwardly stuffing his hands into his pockets. His tone lacked the authority it held before, sounding almost hesitant. Jayden looked at him, a slight frown forming on his face. Part of him wanted to let the officer stew in his discomfort, to let him feel the sting of his own assumptions. But Jayden's mother, ever observant, gave her son a gentle look, a silent reminder of the values she taught him, values of patience, resilience, and grace. With a steady breath, Jayden nodded, acknowledging the apology without any warmth. "Maybe next time don't assume," he replied, his voice quiet but firm, carrying an unspoken message that hung in the air. The words weren't loud, but their weight was undeniable, leaving Officer Scott standing there, rooted in place, feeling smaller than he ever had in his uniform. Jayden turned back to his mother, helping her to her feet with a gentleness that only a loving son could show. The officer watched as they walked away, the distance between them growing with each step, leaving him behind, alone, thoughtful, and, for the first time, questioning his own actions. As Jayden guided his mother away from the scene, he felt a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside him. Relief that his mother was unharmed, a lingering anger at the way he had been treated, and a deep sense of pride in how he had handled himself. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, catching a glimpse of Officer Scott standing there, looking lost and burdened, as if finally realizing the full impact of his actions. Jayden's mother squeezed his hand gently as they walked, her expression warm but weary. "Thank you, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "You were strong back there. I saw everything." Jayden gave her a small smile, though a shadow of frustration still lingered in his eyes. "I just don't get why people look at me like that, Mom. Like I don't belong, like I'm dangerous or something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of silent endurance. His mother stopped, turning to face him, her own eyes reflecting a mix of love and sadness. She brushed a hand over his cheek, a tender gesture that seemed to say more than words ever could. "You've always belonged, Jayden. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less than you are," she whispered, her words both a comfort and a reminder of the strength she knew he would need. Jayden nodded, drawing strength from her reassurance. They continued walking, leaving the store and Officer Scott far behind them. But as they moved forward, Jayden couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had been more than just an encounter with prejudice. It had been a turning point, a reminder that while he couldn't control others' judgments, he could control his own actions and how he responded to them. Meanwhile, back at the store, Officer Scott remained by the doorway, lost in thought. The young man's words echoed in his mind. "Maybe next time, don't assume." It was such a simple phrase, yet it pierced through his layers of authority and training, leaving him feeling vulnerable and reflective in a way he hadn't felt in years. As Officer Scott stood there, rooted in his own silence, the sounds of the bustling street around him faded into the background. Jayden's words had left an uncomfortable mark, one he couldn't easily shake. He realized how quick he had been to judge, how his assumptions had clouded his view and painted an innocent kid as something he was not. It was a moment that forced him to confront his own biases, the very ones he had never questioned before. For years he had seen himself as a protector, someone who maintained order. But now, for the first time, he questioned what kind of order he was upholding. He had assumed he was acting in everyone's best interest, but today he saw that he had let his own prejudice dictate his actions, hurting someone who had done nothing wrong. His mind drifted back to Jayden's steady, unwavering gaze, a look that wasn't angry but was filled with disappointment. It was a look that Scott couldn't forget, one that felt like it cut straight to his core. He remembered Jayden's patience, the quiet dignity with which he had handled himself, and how he had put his mother's well-being above his own hurt. Scott realized that, in that moment, Jayden had shown more strength and maturity than he himself had displayed. As Scott stood alone, his gaze drifted to his reflection in the store window, and he barely recognized the person staring back. The stern, confident officer he prided himself on being was gone, replaced by someone uncertain, questioning. It was as if a mirror had been held up to him, revealing the parts of himself he had tried to ignore. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but perhaps he could do something to prevent it from happening again. Taking a deep breath, he turned and walked back into the store, his footsteps carrying a new weight, a sense of humility he hadn't felt before. For the first time in his career, he felt like he didn't have all the answers, and maybe, he thought, that was exactly what he needed to learn. Inside the store, Officer Scott paced slowly, his mind turning over everything that had happened. He tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling pressing on his chest, but it lingered, nagging at him like a truth he couldn't ignore. The aisles felt quieter now, each shelf and display a silent witness to his recent actions. He glanced at the counter, where the store clerk was ringing up a customer, avoiding eye contact with him. Scott could tell the clerk hadn't fully agreed with what he'd done, and that only deepened the sting of regret. He found himself replaying the scene, every word exchanged, every look given. Why had he reacted that way to Jayden? Scott could still see the quiet disappointment in the young man's eyes, a disappointment that went beyond their brief interaction. It was as if Jayden had expected this kind of treatment, had almost been prepared for it, like it was something he'd faced countless times before. And somehow, that realization made it all worse. Scott had been one more person in a long line of people who had judged Jayden without knowing him. The more Scott thought about it, the more he realized that his uniform, his badge, and his sense of authority had blinded him. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the very purpose of his job, to protect and serve everyone, not just those who fit a certain mold. He thought of the look on Jayden's mother's face as she sat on the bench, shaken from the accident, but holding her son's hand with pride and trust. She hadn't needed to say anything. Her gratitude toward her son was plain as day. Jayden had been the rock she'd needed in that moment, while Scott had been a source of tension, a reminder of judgment rather than support. He sighed deeply, his mind drifting to his own family. He thought of his teenage daughter, how he'd want someone to treat her if she ever found herself in a similar situation. The thought made him feel a pang of shame. How could he expect others to treat his loved ones with respect if he couldn't do the same for someone else's child? He was supposed to be a role model, not just in uniform, but as a person. And today he realized he had fallen short of that. Scott rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of his own shortcomings settle in. He knew he couldn't go back and change his actions, but maybe he could take something from this experience, something he'd ignored for far too long. The world wasn't as black and white as he had once thought. People were more complex, and his assumptions only served to build walls where there should have been bridges. After a few moments, he looked up and made his way back to the counter, where the store clerk was still working, casting him occasional glances of quiet disapproval. Scott cleared his throat, feeling the need to say something, even if it wouldn't undo his mistakes. "Hey," he began, his voice softer than usual. "About earlier, I think I may have gone too far." The clerk paused, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing, waiting for Scott to continue. Scott swallowed, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Apologizing wasn't something he was used to, especially when it came to his role as an officer, where he'd always felt justified in his actions. But this was different. "That kid," Scott said almost to himself, his gaze unfocused as he thought about Jayden. "He didn't deserve that. I shouldn't have assumed the worst of him. I think I was wrong." The store clerk nodded slowly, his expression softening as he seemed to understand the officer's internal struggle. "Sometimes it takes a moment like that to see things clearly," the clerk replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Maybe it's not too late to change things." Scott nodded, letting the clerk's words sink in. Change. The idea felt heavy yet liberating at the same time. He realized that this wasn't just about Jayden or today. It was about how he approached his role, how he viewed the people he'd sworn to serve. Officer Scott left the store quietly, his mind still tangled in a web of self-reflection. The bustling noise of the street greeted him as he stepped out, but it felt muted, distant, as if his thoughts were wrapping around him like a cocoon. He looked down the street where Jayden and his mother had disappeared just moments ago, wondering if he'd ever see them again, and if, in that moment, he'd have the courage to apologize in a way that truly mattered. He walked aimlessly, feeling the weight of his uniform more than he ever had. He'd worn it for years, letting it become a part of him, a layer of protection that seemed to grant him authority and respect. But now, it felt different, like a barrier between him and the world he was supposed to understand. For so long, he had believed his badge gave him the right to judge, to categorize, to act swiftly in ways he thought were justified. Yet here he was, feeling as though the badge had blinded him more than it had helped him see. He remembered his early days on the force when he was eager, idealistic, driven by a desire to make a positive impact on his community. Somewhere along the way, that vision had shifted. He had become guarded, suspicious, assuming that people fit into neat categories, seeing danger where there often was none. Jayden's face flashed in his mind again, that steady, unyielding look in his eyes that communicated more than any words could have. It was a look that made Scott feel small, a reminder that power and respect didn't always come from authority, but from empathy and understanding. Scott continued down the sidewalk, his pace slowing as he passed by small shops and familiar storefronts, each one holding memories he had barely noticed before. He saw people of all ages and backgrounds going about their lives, each one carrying stories he knew nothing about, stories he'd likely never know if he continued looking at them through the narrow lens he'd let define his perspective for so long. He found himself wondering how many of them he'd misjudged over the years, how many he'd looked at through the same filter of suspicion he had used on Jayden. He passed by a coffee shop, glancing through the window. Inside, he saw a group of teenagers laughing over their drinks, talking animatedly with a freedom and ease that felt foreign to him. They reminded him of Jayden, just a young person with dreams, aspirations, things they wanted and worked for, yet often seen as trouble purely because of their youth, their clothes, or in Jayden's case, their skin color. Scott felt a pang of guilt, realizing he'd never fully understood the silent burdens these kids carried, burdens his own actions might have made heavier. Eventually, he found himself at a small park, where he sat on a bench beneath a sprawling tree. The shade felt cool and calming, offering a brief reprieve from the turmoil inside him. He leaned back, staring at the ground, his thoughts churning as he wrestled with everything he had come to question about himself. He thought about Jayden's mother, how she had held her son's hand with pride, how she had trusted him implicitly, even in a moment of crisis. Scott wondered how she must have felt seeing her son treated unfairly, witnessing the look on Jayden's face as he was told to leave the store. Scott closed his eyes, imagining his own daughter in Jayden's shoes. He thought about how he'd feel if she was seen as a threat, as someone who didn't belong, all because of how she looked or the assumptions people made about her. The thought stirred something deep within him, a feeling he couldn't shake. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing a part of himself he hadn't seen, or hadn't wanted to see. Sitting on that bench, he realized he couldn't go back to being the same officer he was before. He couldn't unsee the look in Jayden's eyes, couldn't forget the way his words had hit like a punch to the gut. Maybe next time, don't assume. Scott understood, in a way he hadn't before, that those words weren't just meant for him. They were meant for anyone who wore the same uniform, anyone who carried the same responsibility he did. He had to be better not just for himself, but for his community, for people like Jayden who deserved to be seen for who they were, not for the stereotypes others projected onto them. A soft breeze stirred the leaves above him, and Scott took a deep breath, feeling the weight in his chest ease just slightly. It wasn't enough to undo his mistakes, but it was a start, a reminder that change was still possible, that he could begin again. He sat there a little longer, watching people pass by, each one a quiet testament to the diversity and resilience of his community. For the first time in a long time, he felt ready to see them as they truly were, without the judgments he'd grown accustomed to. Finally, he stood up, feeling a newfound sense of clarity. He didn't know if he'd ever have a chance to make things right with Jayden, but he knew what he needed to do from this point forward. Scott walked back to his patrol car, his steps slower, more deliberate. He sat behind the wheel, staring at the dashboard, feeling the stillness settle around him. The familiar hum of the radio and the chatter from dispatch felt distant, almost irrelevant in light of everything that had unfolded. He couldn't bring himself to turn on the engine just yet. He felt he needed a moment to absorb this new resolve, to let it sink into him in a way that would actually make a difference. As he sat there, he glanced into the rearview mirror, catching his own eyes looking back at him. He saw a man who had let his uniform become a shield, something to hide behind, rather than a symbol of service and protection. He thought about all the years he had spent building a reputation of authority, always expecting others to respect him, to trust his judgment simply because of the badge on his chest. But now he wondered how much of that respect he had truly earned. Had he earned the right to be trusted, or had he just demanded it? A knock on the window pulled him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see the store clerk standing beside his car, looking at him with an expression that seemed a mix of curiosity and quiet understanding. Scott rolled down the window, feeling slightly embarrassed to have been caught in such a reflective moment. "Just thought I'd check in," the clerk said, leaning slightly toward the open window. "I noticed you seemed, well, different today." Scott managed a small, weary smile. "Yeah, you could say that," he replied, his voice softer than usual. He took a breath, debating whether to confide in this stranger, but something told him that the clerk already knew what was on his mind. "Sometimes it's not easy to see ourselves clearly," the clerk said gently, "especially when we've been looking at things a certain way for a long time. But recognizing it, that's the hardest step, and it seems like you're already there." Scott nodded, absorbing the words. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was keeping things safe, you know." He paused, realizing how hollow that justification sounded now. "But I think I was just protecting my own assumptions. I was keeping my world safe from anyone who didn't fit what I thought was normal. And that's not the kind of officer I ever wanted to be." The clerk gave him a reassuring nod. "It's never too late to change that, Officer Scott. Just takes a little courage, a little humility." Scott looked down, his hand resting on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of those words. Humility. He'd always associated strength with authority, with control. But maybe real strength, he was beginning to realize, came from admitting when you were wrong and learning to see the world with a softer gaze. "Thanks," Scott said finally, his voice filled with sincerity, "for not just standing by, for seeing what I couldn't." The clerk offered a small smile and a nod before stepping back, leaving Scott to his thoughts once more. Scott sat there a moment longer, feeling the subtle shift in himself solidify, a commitment taking root. With a newfound sense of purpose, Scott turned on the engine. He wasn't sure what lay ahead or how he'd be able to fix the mistakes he had made, but he knew one thing. He was done hiding behind his badge. Today had been a lesson he would carry forward, and he resolved to start each day from now on with a reminder, to look beyond the surface, to approach each person with respect, and most importantly, to remember that the true strength of his position came from empathy and understanding, not authority alone. As he pulled away from the curb, Scott felt for the first time as if he was on the right path, not just as an officer, but as a person. As Officer Scott drove through the familiar streets, his mind was no longer filled with the usual checklist of tasks and patrol responsibilities. Instead, memories of past encounters flashed through his mind, moments he'd brushed off, incidents where he had acted similarly to how he had with Jayden. He realized how many times he had made judgments based on his own assumptions, never considering the harm they might cause. Today had been a wake-up call, one that had shaken him deeply. He thought about his next steps, about how he could change his approach and begin to make amends. His mind drifted back to Jayden, remembering the young man's quiet resolve, his strength in the face of unjust treatment. Scott wanted to find a way to convey his regret to Jayden, though he wasn't sure if he'd ever get the chance. It felt like a slim hope, but he wanted to believe that somehow he could reach out, even if it was just a small gesture. A sudden idea struck him as he drove, and he found himself heading back toward the neighborhood he'd patrolled earlier. He wasn't sure if he'd find Jayden there, but something in him urged him to try. As he turned onto a quiet street lined with modest homes and the occasional small shop, he spotted a familiar car parked on the curb. Jayden's mother's car. His pulse quickened slightly as he recognized it from the accident earlier, now parked safely, a slight dent still visible on the front bumper. Scott parked a short distance away and took a deep breath, unsure of how he would be received. He felt a knot of nerves tighten in his stomach as he stepped out of his vehicle, his hands briefly fidgeting as he worked up the courage to approach the house. The truth was, he didn't have a script for this, no prepared lines or practiced speech. He just had his own honesty and a hope for forgiveness. As he walked toward the house, the front door opened, and Jayden appeared, carrying a bag of groceries in one hand. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he saw Scott approaching. His expression shifted quickly, a guarded look crossing his face, as if bracing himself for another confrontation. Scott stopped a few steps away, keeping a respectful distance. For a moment, they stood there in silence, both unsure of how to begin. Finally, Scott cleared his throat, his voice quieter than Jayden had ever heard it. "Jayden?" he began, choosing his words carefully. "I know I might be the last person you want to see right now, but I felt I owed you an apology. A real one." Jayden's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze steady and unflinching, but he said nothing, waiting for Scott to continue. Scott took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "What I did back there, it was wrong. I judged you without reason, without understanding, and you didn't deserve that." He paused, searching Jayden's face for any sign of a reaction. "I came here because I wanted to let you know that I see that now, and I'm sorry. Truly." Jayden's expression softened just a fraction, though he remained quiet, letting the officer's words sink in. Scott waited, feeling the silence stretch between them like a test of his sincerity. Jayden's eyes held a mix of emotions, hurt, skepticism, and perhaps a hint of curiosity. The young man seemed to be considering Scott's words, weighing them against the memory of what had happened. After a moment, Jayden spoke, his tone steady but edged with a quiet strength. "Why now?" he asked, his gaze never wavering. "You didn't listen back there, you didn't care, so why are you here now?" Scott swallowed, feeling the directness of Jayden's question. It was a fair one, and he didn't want to respond with anything less than honesty. He took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing as he let go of the need to defend himself. "Because I realized something today," Scott began, his voice soft but clear. "I realized that the way I saw you was based on assumptions I'd built over years. Assumptions I never questioned because they made me feel safe, made me feel like I was in control. But I was wrong. I saw the way you handled yourself, the way you took care of your mom after the accident. You were stronger and more mature than I was, and that made me question a lot about myself." Jayden's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Scott could tell that he hadn't expected such an open admission, and it gave him the courage to continue. "I came here because I wanted you to know that I'm not proud of what I did, and I wanted you to know that you taught me something today, something I needed to learn. I'm sorry it took this long for me to see it." Jayden's posture softened, though his face remained thoughtful. He seemed to be searching Scott's face for any sign of insincerity, his gaze piercing but no longer angry. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice calmer though still guarded. "People make mistakes, Officer Scott," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "But it's not just about saying sorry. It's about what you do next. If you really mean what you're saying, then show it. Be better than this." Scott nodded, absorbing Jaden's words with a humility that he hadn't felt in a long time. He realized Jaden was giving him a challenge, a quiet invitation to prove himself through actions rather than empty apologies. It was a powerful message, one that resonated deeply. Scott could sense that Jaden's forgiveness, if it was ever to come, would not be freely given. It would have to be earned through real change. "I will," Scott replied, his voice steady, conviction growing with each word. "I don't expect you to take my word for it, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better, from today forward. I owe that to you and to everyone I've treated unfairly because of my own assumptions." Jaden studied him for a moment, his expression softening slightly, as if he could see the sincerity in Scott's eyes. "Good," he replied, crossing his arms, his gaze still holding Scott accountable. "Because people like me, we go through this every day. We get looked at, judged, doubted, just for being who we are. And it's tiring. We shouldn't have to keep proving we're worthy of respect." Scott felt the weight of Jaden's words settle heavily on him. He understood now that this was more than just an apology for one incident. It was a step toward dismantling the harmful habits he had carried for years. Jaden's experience was a reality for many, a daily struggle for dignity that Scott had never considered before. "Thank you for telling me that," Scott said, nodding slowly. It's hard to hear, but I needed to. I see now how blind I've been to something that's been right in front of me." A brief silence passed between them, but it wasn't tense. There was a mutual understanding forming, a tentative bridge built on honesty and a willingness to change. Jaden nodded, acknowledging Scott's words with a subtle but significant shift in his expression. He seemed to appreciate that Scott wasn't offering hollow promises or excuses, just the intention to listen and learn. After another moment, Jaden extended a hand, a small but meaningful gesture. Scott looked down, a bit surprised, before reaching out to shake it, feeling a mix of respect and gratitude. The handshake was brief, but it held a quiet strength that went beyond words. As they released hands, Jaden gave Scott a steady look. "I'll be watching," he said simply, a small but knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Scott felt a strange sense of relief as he shook Jaden's hand, the young man's firm grip grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. It was as if, in that brief moment of contact, Jaden had shared a piece of his resilience, his silent endurance. Scott had spent years building walls around himself, separating himself from the community he was meant to serve. But this one interaction had left a crack in that armor, allowing in a glimmer of clarity he hadn't known he was missing. Jaden stepped back, tucking his hands into his pockets, his stance relaxed yet cautious. Scott noticed the faint smile tugging at the corners of Jaden's mouth, a subtle acknowledgement of Scott's effort, but also a reminder that respect would need to be earned over time. Jaden was offering a cautious openness, not forgiveness. It was a reminder that trust couldn't be bought with one apology. It would require continuous, visible change. "Thank you, Jaden," Scott said, his voice filled with a gratitude he hoped the young man would understand. "You didn't have to give me this chance to be better, but I appreciate it. I know I've got a lot to learn." Jaden shrugged, a calm acceptance in his expression. Everyone's got something to learn, but not everyone's willing to admit it. That's the difference. Scott took a breath, realizing how young yet wise Jaden sounded, as if he'd already navigated a lifetime of challenges Scott was only beginning to comprehend. Jaden's words held a maturity beyond his years, a resilience that had been shaped by experiences Scott couldn't fully grasp, but which he now knew he had to try to understand. As Jaden turned to head back into his house, his mother appeared at the door, her gaze landing on Scott. She looked at him with an expression of mixed relief and guarded respect, aware of the conversation but unsure of how much it had truly changed. She gave a small nod to her son, acknowledging his quiet strength, and then looked at Scott, her expression shifting to something softer but still skeptical. Scott, feeling the weight of her gaze, nodded respectfully to her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "I'm sorry for how I acted. You raised a strong young man, You should be proud." Her face softened, a touch of pride in her eyes as she glanced at Jayden. "I am proud," she replied, her voice laced with both warmth and a hint of challenge. "And I hope you'll remember what he's shown you today. People like us have had to be strong, Officer Scott, not by choice, but by necessity. We face situations like this all the time. What's different here is that you're listening." Scott felt the gravity of her words settle over him like a heavy but necessary weight. He nodded, accepting the responsibility she was placing on him. "I understand, and I'll do my best to make sure that I don't just listen today, but every day." Jayden's mother offered a small, approving nod before retreating into the house, leaving Scott and Jayden standing alone once more. The street was quiet now, the bustling noise of the neighborhood distant, giving the moment a kind of stillness that felt charged with significance. Scott knew that this was a turning point, not just for today, but for the path he wanted to take as both an officer and a person. He had glimpsed the strength in Jayden's quiet courage and his mother's unspoken resilience, and he knew he couldn't go back to who he'd been before. Jayden gave him one last look, a look that held both encouragement and expectation. "Remember, actions speak louder than words," he said, a final reminder before he turned to head inside. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Scott standing alone on the street, a mix of humility and determination washing over him. Scott took a deep breath, looking up at the sky, the weight of the moment grounding him yet filling him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This was his chance to start anew, to rebuild his role in the community, not as an authority figure, but as someone who would truly serve, protect, and respect the lives he encountered. He turned back toward his patrol car, feeling the first spark of a long journey toward redemption, a journey that would require consistent choices day by day to prove he could be a better man than he'd been. As he walked back to his car, he felt something he hadn't anticipated, a sense of hope, one that came from knowing he still had the power to change, to grow, and to break free from the confines of his old ways. Back in his patrol car, Scott sat quietly, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The street was calm, the soft hum of neighborhood sounds filtering through the open window. He let out a long breath, feeling both the heaviness of the past hour and the clarity that had come from it. The uniform he wore, which had once felt like an impenetrable barrier between him and the world, now felt different. It felt like a reminder, a symbol not just of duty, but of responsibility, one he had to carry with new integrity. As he sat there, he thought about his own family, especially his daughter, who was just a few years younger than Jayden. He imagined her in Jayden's shoes, facing the kind of prejudice he had shown. It was a humbling thought, one that made his heart clench with regret. He realized now that he'd been clinging to an outdated mindset, seeing the world through a narrow lens, failing to understand the full humanity of the people he served. Today, Jayden had helped him remove that lens, even if just a little, and see things more clearly. Scott knew that this was just the beginning. The conversation he'd had with Jayden and his mother was a moment of reckoning, but it wouldn't erase years of built-up biases or habits. Changing how he saw the world, how he treated people, especially those he had been so quick to judge, would require time and commitment, and it would require humility, something he now understood was crucial for his growth. He realized that his role in the community had to go beyond authority and enforcement. It needed to be about understanding and empathy. He felt a deep need to take action, something meaningful that would reinforce this shift, a way to ensure he didn't fall back into old patterns. As he reflected, an idea began to form in his mind. He'd seen too many young people like Jayden who carried the weight of distrust and disappointment toward law enforcement, and he couldn't blame them. But maybe there was a way to start bridging that divide, to create a space where voices like Jayden's could be heard rather than silenced. Determined, Scott decided he would talk to his captain about creating a program, a community engagement initiative that would bring officers and young people from the neighborhood together. The program could be a series of workshops, conversations, or activities where both sides could share their experiences, their perspectives, and hopefully start to build mutual understanding. Scott knew this was ambitious, and he was aware it wouldn't be easy. But he felt strongly that it was necessary. As he thought through the details, his mind wandered back to Jaden. He wanted to involve him, to reach out and ask if he'd be interested in being part of something that could benefit the entire community. Jaden had shown remarkable strength and wisdom, qualities that Scott felt could inspire others and lend credibility to the initiative. If he could somehow gain Jaden's support, it might help break down some of the walls that divided them. Scott started his car, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that his past mistakes would not disappear, but he hoped that with each step he took toward positive change, he could balance the scales, even if just a little. He drove back to the station, his mind racing with ideas. He thought about how he could bring the community together, creating a place where young people felt safe to express their frustrations and aspirations, where officers like himself could listen, learn, and build trust. When he arrived at the station, he didn't waste any time. He went straight to his captain's office, feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement as he prepared to present his idea. As he knocked on the door and entered, he took a deep breath, determined to do whatever it took to bring this vision to life. The captain, a seasoned officer who had seen Scott through many years on the force, looked up, surprised to see him so visibly moved. Scott shared his thoughts, speaking with a conviction that came from today's humbling experience. He explained the need for something more than just law enforcement in their community, something that could foster true understanding. He spoke about Jaden, about the lessons he had learned in a single encounter, and how those lessons could impact the force if others were open to them. The captain listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression shifting as he considered Scott's words. By the end of the conversation, Scott felt a glimmer of hope. The captain agreed to support the program, even offering resources to help get it started. He understood the potential impact it could have, not just for the youth in the community, but for the officers who served it. As Scott left the office, he felt a newfound sense of responsibility settle over him. He knew this was just one step, but it was a meaningful one. He was ready to work, to put in the effort to rebuild the trust he had taken for granted. And maybe one day, he would be able to look at someone like Jaden and know he had truly made a difference. He walked out of the station with a sense of purpose that felt deeper and more genuine than any feeling he'd had in his years of service. It was a beginning, a long journey toward redemption, one he was finally ready to take. Leaving the station, Scott felt a new energy within him, a sense of resolve he hadn't experienced in years. He knew that setting up a program wouldn't be enough on its own. He would need to actively engage, to listen, and to show up with genuine humility. For this to work, he couldn't just be the face of the program. He had to be a student in it, learning from the people he'd once failed to see clearly. Over the next few weeks, Scott threw himself into the planning process. He connected with local leaders, youth organizations, and even a few community members who had been skeptical of the police in the past. The response was mixed. Some were open to the idea, while others were hesitant, even hostile. He could feel the skepticism in their voices, the unspoken doubts about whether his intentions were sincere or just another attempt at good publicity. Scott accepted their wariness, understanding it was part of the process, part of the trust he'd have to earn from scratch. One evening, Scott decided to reach out to Jaden. He didn't want to assume Jaden would be interested in helping, but he felt he owed it to him to extend the offer. After all, Jaden had been the catalyst for this change, the person who had unknowingly shifted Scott's entire perspective. Taking a deep breath, Scott dialed the number he had tracked down through a mutual contact in the neighborhood. Jaden's voice came over the line, cautious and reserved. Scott introduced himself, explaining the purpose of his call, and then carefully laid out his idea. He described the program's goals, the kind of environment he hoped to create, a safe space for honest conversations between officers and young people from the community. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Scott could almost feel Jaden weighing his words, considering what this involvement would mean for him. Finally, Jaden spoke, his tone steady but thoughtful. "Why me?" he asked simply. Why do you want me involved? Scott paused, then answered with as much honesty as he could muster. Because I learned more from you in one afternoon than I have in years on this job, he admitted. You helped me see things I should have understood a long time ago, and I think you have a voice people will listen to, a voice I need to hear. I don't want this program to be about officers talking at people. I want it to be about real conversations, real change, and I think you could help make that happen. Jayden was quiet for a few more moments, letting Scott's words settle. Finally, he responded, his tone firm but open. All right, I'll give it a try, he said. But I'll be honest with you, Officer Scott. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for people like me, for the next kid who walks into that store and doesn't have to go through what I did. Scott felt a swell of gratitude mixed with respect. Thank you, Jayden. That's exactly why this program needs you, he replied. In the weeks that followed, Scott and Jayden worked together to bring the program to life. Despite his initial hesitance, Jayden threw himself into the project with an energy that surprised even him. He had agreed to participate out of a sense of duty to his community. But as he got involved, he found himself beginning to believe in the possibility of real change. For the first time, he felt he had a platform where his voice, and the voices of others like him, might actually be heard, respected, and valued. Scott, on his part, approached each meeting and planning session with a humility that had been absent before. He listened more than he spoke, soaking up perspectives he had overlooked for years. Jayden and other young people from the community were candid, sometimes painfully so, about their experiences and their frustrations with the way they had been treated by people like him. They told stories of feeling watched, judged, and dismissed, stories that mirrored Jayden's own experience in the store. And each time, Scott felt the weight of those stories settle over him, realizing just how deep the wounds ran. They decided to name the program Bridges, a symbol of the gap they were hoping to close between the community and the officers who served it. Together, they arranged a series of workshops that would allow community members to share their stories, engage in dialogues, and suggest ways to improve relations with the police. Jayden suggested a session where officers would walk in their shoes by participating in simulations that put them in the position of someone frequently scrutinized and judged. Scott readily agreed, recognizing that true empathy often required experiencing the discomfort others felt daily. The first event took place in a local community center, a modest building but one that had served as a gathering place for decades. Scott arrived early, feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He hadn't been sure how the community would respond, but as people began to filter in, he saw faces he recognized, some from past patrols, others from brief interactions around town. Jayden walked in with a few friends, and Scott noticed how his presence seemed to reassure the younger attendees, many of whom had been hesitant to show up. Jayden's quiet but strong influence was undeniable. As the event began, Scott took a step back, letting Jayden take the lead. Jayden opened the session by introducing himself, speaking plainly and without pretense. He shared his own experience, recounting the day in the store, how it felt to be seen as a suspect rather than as a person. His voice was steady, each word carrying the weight of his truth. As he spoke, Scott watched the faces of his fellow officers, seeing how Jayden's words affected them. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, but others seemed deeply moved, their expressions softening as they took in the young man's courage. After Jayden's introduction, they opened the floor to the community members, giving them a safe space to express their feelings and share their stories. One by one, people stood up to speak, an elderly man recounting his years of mistrust, a mother tearfully sharing her fears for her teenage son, a young woman talking about how she often felt like she had to prove her innocence just by existing. Scott listened to each story, feeling a deep sadness mixed with a desire to change things, to make sure that the people standing before him would never feel invisible again. When it was the officer's turn to speak, Scott stepped forward, sharing his own journey over the past few months. He spoke candidly about his mistakes, about the assumptions he had once made without realizing their impact. He didn't try to justify his actions or defend himself. Instead, he offered an apology, not just to Jaden, but to everyone in the room. He promised to do better, to listen and learn, to take what he was hearing to heart and use it to guide him in his role. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. There was no easy resolution, no sudden outpouring of forgiveness, but there was a sense of mutual understanding beginning to form. People lingered, talking to one another, sharing more stories, some even speaking quietly with the officers who had come. For the first time, Scott saw genuine conversations happening between two groups that had often viewed each other with suspicion. It was a small step, but it was a meaningful one. As the evening drew to a close, Scott caught Jaden's eye across the room. Jaden nodded slightly, a hint of a smile crossing his face, a gesture that conveyed more than words could. Scott knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be more events, more challenges, and more moments of reckoning. But seeing the room full of people, some smiling, some simply talking, gave him a sense of hope he hadn't expected. When the room finally emptied and Scott and Jaden were left standing alone, Scott reached out a hand. Jaden hesitated for a brief second before shaking it, his grip firm but respectful. "We're on the right path, Officer Scott," Jaden said quietly. "Just keep walking it." Scott nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude and pride. "Thank you, Jaden, for giving me the chance and for giving this community the chance." With that, they parted ways, but Scott knew he'd see Jaden again soon. There would be more work to do, more bridges to build, and as he walked out of the community center, Scott felt a deep sense of purpose settling within him, a commitment not only to the program, but to the values it represented. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, ready to face whatever came next. Over the following months, Bridges became a fixture in the community, growing beyond what Scott and Jaden had first imagined. Monthly workshops, open dialogues, and community events brought people together in ways Scott could have never anticipated. Scott became more than just an officer in uniform. He became a familiar, approachable figure in the neighborhood, a part of the community rather than a detached authority figure. Jaden, too, grew into a quiet leader, his strength and resilience inspiring other young people to find their own voices. One of the most impactful events was the Walk in My Shoes simulation, a session Jaden had suggested early on. In it, officers took part in scenarios designed to give them a taste of the assumptions and biases that people of color, particularly young black men, often faced daily. Officers were asked to role-play scenarios like being followed in a store, questioned unnecessarily, or assumed guilty without cause. At first, many of Scott's fellow officers found it uncomfortable, some even resistant. But as they went through the exercises, the discomfort turned into realization, and by the end, they walked away with a renewed perspective, a deeper understanding of the unseen experiences of those they served. Scott witnessed the transformation in his colleagues and felt a deep sense of pride. He watched as fellow officers began approaching situations differently, with patience and a willingness to listen. Complaints from the community about profiling incidents decreased, and trust began to build, slowly but genuinely. Scott saw a shift, not just in the community's attitude, but in the attitudes of the officers themselves. They were learning as he had that respect went both ways, that understanding required an open heart and a willingness to change. Through this journey, Scott and Jaden's relationship also deepened. They were no longer just collaborators in the program, but had grown to be friends, sharing conversations that ranged from future plans to the challenges of growing up in a world often fraught with tension. Jaden admitted, during one quiet moment, that he'd never thought an officer could genuinely care about what he had to say. Scott, humbled, confessed that he never thought he'd find such strength and wisdom in someone so young. Months turned into a year, and Bridges continued to thrive. At an annual gathering, Scott was invited to speak, his voice steady as he looked out over the crowd, a mix of families, officers, young people, and elders from the community. He shared his journey openly, talking about the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he'd learned. but he spent most of his speech acknowledging the people who had helped him change, the people who had been patient enough to give him a second chance. He saved his final words for Jaden. "I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for this young man," Scott said, looking over at Jaden, who stood near the front, watching him with an encouraging nod. "Jaden taught me that change isn't something we ask of others. It's something we begin in ourselves. I thought I was here to protect this community, but I realized that this community was here to teach me what protection and respect truly mean." The crowd applauded, but the moment wasn't about praise. It was about acknowledgement and growth. Scott knew he was a better person because of Jaden, and Jaden, in turn, had found a purpose that extended far beyond his own life. As the event ended, people lingered, shaking hands, talking and laughing, a sense of unity hanging in the air. Scott watched it all, feeling an overwhelming gratitude for where he stood and who he had become. He spotted Jaden, who was surrounded by friends and family, his mother beaming with pride. Catching Scott's eye, Jaden made his way over, a genuine smile on his face. "Not bad, Officer Scott," Jaden said, his tone warm but teasing. "You've come a long way." Scott chuckled, a sense of peace settling over him. "Couldn't have done it without you, Jaden." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the crowd fading into the background, as they shared a look of mutual respect and understanding. Jaden extended his hand, and Scott took it firmly, knowing that this was more than a handshake. It was a promise to continue the work, to keep building bridges, to honor the trust that had been placed in him. As they parted, Scott looked around at the faces of the community, realizing that this was where he belonged, in a role that went beyond his badge. He no longer saw himself as a protector looking down from a distance, but as part of the fabric of this community, standing alongside them as an ally, a friend, and a learner. And as he walked out into the evening, the warmth of the gathering behind him, Scott knew that this journey would continue. There would be new challenges, but now he faced them with open eyes, an open heart, and the unwavering belief that true strength lay not in authority, but in empathy, respect, and the willingness to grow. If this story resonated with you, give it a thumbs up and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Let's keep the conversation going and work together to build a world of understanding and respect. Thanks for watching.